The desert has no mercy. Under a burning sun, endless dunes stretch to the horizon, a vast sea of silence where men vanish without a trace. In 1942, this silence was broken not only by engines and gunfire, but by whispers, shadows, and illusions. From above, German reconnaissance planes reported something extraordinary. Entire armored divisions appearing overnight in places that, just days before, were empty stretches of sand. Dozens of tanks, trucks, artillery batteries, movement, life. But when Rommel's scouts reached those positions, they found nothing. Just rubber, canvas, and the wind. This was no accident. It was part of a carefully crafted deception. A new kind of warfare born in the unforgiving sands of North Africa. A battle not of strength, but of imagination. The British Eighth Army, exhausted and outnumbered, faced an almost impossible task. Stop Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, whose tactics had humiliated Allied forces across Libya and Egypt. Conventional weapons had failed. What came next was something entirely different. A plan so bold it bordered on absurdity. It began not with soldiers, but with artists, painters, stage designers, sound engineers, even illusionists. Men who once worked in theaters and film studios were now enlisted to create a different kind of show. One that would unfold on the largest stage the world had ever seen, the Sahara Desert. They would turn empty sand into fortresses, inflate tanks from rubber and paint shadows to mimic reality, send fake radio signals across miles of barren land. Their mission? To make the enemy believe in what did not exist, and to hide what truly did. For the first time in history, the outcome of a major military campaign would depend not just on courage or firepower, but on deception, illusion, and the ability to manipulate perception itself. As the sun sets over the golden dunes, an invisible war begins. A war of ghosts, mirages, and men who mastered the art of making the impossible seem real. This is the story of the Desert Ghost Army. The soldiers who fought with air, sound, and shadows. North Africa, 1941. A new front of the Second World War had opened, one that would soon become a proving ground for strategy, endurance, and deception. The desert was a battlefield unlike any other. It offered no shelter, no cover, and no mercy. In this vast expanse of shifting sand, armies could vanish in a day, swallowed by dust storms, heat, or exhaustion. The landscape itself became both enemy and accomplice. For the Axis, the man commanding these sands was Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. His tactics were swift, unpredictable, and devastating. Using speed and deception of his own, Rommel had driven the British back across Libya, capturing supplies, weapons, and morale in one relentless offensive after another. The British Eighth Army, under constant pressure, was fighting not just an opponent, but the terrain. Every mile of movement required convoys of fuel, water, and spare parts. Every decision risked disaster if a single supply line failed. Even the horizon lied. Distance and mirage distorted everything. A tank formation could appear massive, until it dissolved into heat haze. Commanders quickly realized that in such an environment, what the enemy believed could be as important as what was actually true. Rommel's greatest advantage was surprise. He attacked where the British least expected, appearing out of nowhere, striking fast, then vanishing again into the dunes. To stop him, the British would have to fight not only with bullets, but with imagination, turning Rommel's own weapon against him. The idea began to take shape quietly among officers of the Eighth Army. If the desert could trick the eyes of men every day, perhaps it could also deceive their minds. What if they could make Rommel chase shadows? What if they could create armies that didn't exist, and hide the ones that did? It was here, amid the dust and desperation of the North African campaign, that the seeds of the Ghost Army were planted. A war of steel was becoming a war of illusion. And the desert, with its mirages, its silence, and its vast emptiness, was the perfect stage for it. It began, as many revolutions do, in silence. In a dimly lit operations tent outside Cairo, a handful of British officers and intelligence analysts gathered around a sand-covered map. They were running out of options. Rommel's forces were fast, unpredictable, and dangerously close to reaching Egypt, and the Suez Canal, lifeline of the British Empire. Among those present was Brigadier Dudley Clark, a man whose mind worked differently from most soldiers. Clark had a background in journalism and theater before the war. To him, warfare wasn't only about firepower, it was about narrative, about what the enemy believed was happening. He proposed something radical. What if we could make Rommel think our army is somewhere it's not? The room fell silent. Clark's idea sounded like madness, or genius. He suggested building a phantom army, complete with fake tanks, trucks, camps, and radio chatter. Not to fight, but to perform, to make the desert itself lie. Soon, Clark assembled an unlikely team. They weren't traditional soldiers. They were painters, sculptors, stage designers, sound technicians, and illusionists. Some had worked in London theaters, others in film production. Now, instead of painting sets for plays, they would paint shadows on trucks to mimic tanks. Instead of designing costumes, they would build entire armies made of canvas and rubber. Among them was a quiet genius named Jasper Maskelyne, a stage magician from a long, family line of illusionists. He had once made entire people disappear on stage in Piccadilly. Now, he dreamed of making divisions vanish in the desert. To the skeptics in the military command, these men seemed like dreamers, artists in uniform. But in a war of attrition and desperation, even dreams were worth trying. The first experiments began outside Alexandria. They inflated rubber tanks under the scorching sun, arranging them in precise formations visible from the air. They built fake supply lines using empty barrels covered with tarps. They even created the illusion of troop movement by dragging canvas-covered jeeps across the sand to mimic tank tracks. When reconnaissance planes flew overhead, the results were astonishing. Photographs showed what looked like a full-scale armored division preparing for battle. Rommel's intelligence units took note and shifted their defenses. It worked. For the first time, illusion had achieved what brute force could not: control of the enemy's attention. That day, the British command realized something extraordinary. That in a desert defined by mirages, the greatest weapon might be the power to create one. The desert became their stage. Day after day, under a merciless sun, the men of Clark's deception units rehearsed a performance unlike anything the world had ever seen. From a distance, it looked like an ordinary military camp. Closer inspection revealed a bizarre sight. Men hammering air valves into the sides of giant rubber shells, others painting metallic reflections onto canvas, or setting up dummy radio masts with no wires attached. This was Operation Camouflage, the art of making something out of nothing. They built inflatable tanks that could be carried by 2 men, but looked, from above, like 40-ton Shermans. They placed wooden frames beneath painted tarps to mimic the outlines of artillery batteries. Even the smallest details mattered. They left tracks in the sand to simulate heavy traffic, and erected fake latrines and cooking fires to complete the illusion of a living army. At night, the magic continued. Electricians wired up fake headlights to move along desert roads, mimicking convoys that didn't exist. Loudspeakers blared the distant rumble of engines, recorded and looped to suggest entire battalions on the move. Radio operators transmitted coded messages filled with deliberate errors, false reports designed to be intercepted by German intelligence. Each trick fed into the next, building an elaborate web of deception. And the genius of it was that it had to look imperfect. If it appeared too neat, too deliberate, the Germans would know something was wrong. So the artists learned to imitate chaos, to scatter tents unevenly, to spill fake oil under vehicles, to leave broken equipment lying around. They learned to make the illusion of war look exactly like the real thing. Their success wasn't measured in battles won, but in time gained, in divisions misdirected, in bombs that fell harmlessly on empty sand. Each day they fooled the Luftwaffe or Rommel's scouts was another day for the real 8th Army to regroup and prepare. One officer described it best. Our job wasn't to kill the enemy. It was to confuse him, to make him waste his bullets on shadows. By mid-1942, these shadow soldiers had become so effective that even high-ranking British officers visiting the front couldn't always tell which camps were real. Behind the lines, rumor began to spread among the troops. Stories of phantom divisions, of armies that appeared overnight and vanished by dawn. Most soldiers never met the men who created them. They were ghosts in every sense of the word, but their work was shaping the course of the war. By late 1942, the war in North Africa had reached its breaking point. Rommel's Afrika Korps, though stretched thin, still held a deadly grip on the desert. Facing him stood General Bernard Montgomery, commander of the British Eighth Army, determined to deliver a decisive blow. But Montgomery knew that brute force alone would not win this battle. Rommel had proven time, and again that he could outthink his opponents, striking where they least expected. So, this time, Montgomery turned to an invisible ally, the masters of deception, the men of the Ghost Army. The plan was codenamed Operation Bertram. Its objective: convince Rommel that the main British attack would come from the south, while the real strike would launch from the north. To achieve this, the deception units would have to create an entire fake army, complete with hundreds of tanks, supply depots, and artillery batteries, all conjured from rubber, plywood, and illusion. For weeks, the desert became a theater of smoke and mirrors. Under Clark's direction, soldiers inflated thousands of dummy tanks, positioning them in neat, visible formations across the southern front. They built false roads and depots, stacked empty crates to look like ammunition stores, and even constructed a dummy pipeline that appeared to be slowly extending toward the front line, a subtle clue suggesting that the army was preparing for a future offensive there. Meanwhile, in the north, real tanks and artillery were disguised as harmless supply trucks using wooden frames and canvas covers. By day, they looked like logistics vehicles. By night, they shed their disguises and rolled into position for the actual assault. The deception was total. Even the smallest details were accounted for. Tire tracks were carefully rerouted to match the false narrative, while fake wireless traffic buzzed across the airwaves, describing troop movements that didn't exist. From the air, it was flawless. Rommel's reconnaissance pilots reported exactly what the British wanted him to see: a massive buildup in the south and little movement in the north. The illusion worked. Rommel shifted key units to defend the wrong sector, spreading his already thin resources even further. When the real attack began on the night of October 23, 1942, the Germans were caught off guard. The northern assault, led by real divisions that had lain hidden under fake tarps for weeks, struck with overwhelming force. The battle that followed would become one of the most important turning points of the entire war. El Alamein wasn't just a victory of arms, it was a victory of imagination. In the days that followed, as Rommel's forces retreated across the desert, British officers quietly toasted the strange alliance of soldiers, artists, and illusionists who had made it possible. Their illusions had fooled the desert fox himself and changed the fate of North Africa. When the smoke cleared over El Alamein, the desert was silent again. Burning wrecks dotted the horizon, and the wind carried the scent of oil and sand, a reminder of what had just unfolded. Rommel's army was in retreat, leaving behind hundreds of vehicles, thousands of prisoners, and a shattered dream of domination in North Africa. But for a small group of men, the artists, engineers, and illusionists who had built the fake armies, victory came with quiet disbelief. Their weapons had been made of rubber, wood, and air, yet they had helped shape one of the most decisive victories of the war. Reports flooded in from intelligence officers. The Germans had fully believed the deception. Captured documents and intercepted communications confirmed it. Rommel had diverted men and armor to the southern sector, convinced the British attack would come from there. The trick had worked perfectly. Operation Bertram had been more than a success. It was proof that perception could win wars. For the first time in modern military history, illusion had been elevated to the level of artillery and strategy. Within the British command, the achievement sparked fascination. Officers who once mocked the camouflage clowns, as they were called, now studied their work with newfound respect. Reports from Montgomery's headquarters described the deception as flawless, a masterpiece of military theater. But outside the war rooms, most soldiers never knew who was responsible. The Ghost Army's work remained secret, its existence hidden beneath the official triumphs of El Alamein. The magicians, artists, and technicians who had given shape to that mirage returned quietly to their units, uncelebrated, their mission complete. In the months that followed, British propaganda celebrated El Alamein as the turning point in the Desert Campaign. Churchill himself declared, "Before Alamein we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat. He wasn't wrong. But what few realized was that behind that turning point stood an army that had never truly existed. Their illusions had deceived not just the enemy, but history itself. As the Eighth Army pushed westward across Libya, the techniques born in the desert would soon spread, refined, expanded, and exported to new fronts: Sicily, Italy, and eventually Normandy. The Ghost Army had proven that in the age of total war, the mind could be just as powerful a battlefield as the ground beneath it. The desert had given birth to an idea, and that idea refused to die. Long after the battles of North Africa ended, the art of deception that began among the dunes traveled with the Allied armies across the Mediterranean and into Europe. In 1943, when the Allies prepared to invade Sicily, the principles of Operation Bertram were reborn on a grander scale. This new deception, Operation Barclay and Operation Mincemeat, sought to convince Hitler that the real invasion would strike Greece or Sardinia, not Sicily. The same techniques pioneered in the desert now evolved into an orchestra of illusion. Fake radio chatter filled the airwaves. Inflatable tanks and landing craft appeared in ports that would never see real combat. Even a dead body, dressed as a British officer and released into the sea, carried falsified invasion plans that German intelligence eagerly swallowed. The deception worked once again. Axis commanders diverted forces far from Sicily, giving the real invasion a crucial advantage. The Ghost Army's spirit was alive, invisible, but everywhere. As the war moved toward its climax, the Allies turned deception into a weapon of doctrine. By 1944, a new generation of specialists, inspired by Clark's original desert experiments, was planning the greatest illusion in military history: Operation Fortitude, the cover plan for the D-Day landings. In this operation, entire fake divisions, complete with dummy tanks, sound effects, and radio traffic, were created in southeast England. Their mission: to convince the Germans that the Allied invasion would land at Pas-de-Calais instead of Normandy. The deception was flawless. Even days after the Normandy landings had begun, German commanders refused to redeploy critical units, still convinced that the real invasion was yet to come. It was the same principle born years earlier under the scorching North African sun: the belief that what the enemy thinks is often more powerful than what actually exists. From Cairo to Calais, from sandstorms to stormy seas, the echoes of the Desert Ghost Army shaped the fate of nations. They had turned war into performance, and the world, still reeling from the scale of the conflict, barely realized it. Their craft, part science, part illusion, part madness, had quietly rewritten the rules of warfare. They were soldiers who never fired a shot, yet carried the weight of 1,000 battles. For the men of the Ghost Army, victory never felt like triumph. Their war was fought in silence, in secrecy, and often in doubt. They had created illusions so convincing that entire divisions were destroyed chasing them, and while their deception saved thousands of Allied lives, the moral burden of their success lingered long after the guns fell silent. Jasper Maskelyne, the magician who once performed to packed theaters in London, became a ghost himself after the war. He claimed credit for many deceptions, but official recognition was slow, and much of his work remained classified for decades. He died believing that the world had forgotten the soldiers who turned imagination into armor. Others, like the engineers and radio operators who served in Clark's units, returned to civilian life with quiet pride. They never spoke much about what they had done. To them, it wasn't about medals or glory. It was about survival. They had seen what real war could do, and they chose a different kind of weapon. But even among their comrades, the camouflage men were often misunderstood. Some frontline soldiers dismissed them as tricksters, toy soldiers who played games while others bled. They didn't understand that without those games, thousands might have died. In the long years after the war, as archives were declassified and testimonies emerged, the truth began to surface. Historians uncovered reports of the deception unit's work, photographs of inflatable tanks standing proudly in the desert, letters written by young men who couldn't explain to their families what they were doing, but knew it mattered. Their creations were never meant to last. The rubber tanks deflated, the fake camps were dismantled, and the props of war disappeared into history. But their legacy endured, not in monuments or medals, but in a simple, haunting truth. That imagination had saved lives. The irony was never lost on them. They had built illusions in a time of brutal reality. They had lied. And in doing so, they had preserved the truth of humanity itself. In the quiet years that followed, some of them returned to art, to design, to film. They used the same skills they had once wielded for war to create again, this time for peace. For them, the desert was never just a battlefield. It was a canvas, a place where creativity had met chaos and somehow won. The story of the Desert Ghost Army might have faded into the sand, forgotten like so many wartime secrets. But its echoes never truly disappeared. In the decades that followed, as technology evolved and wars changed shape, the lessons born under the North African sun continued to guide the invisible hands of strategy. Every radar, decoy, every false signal, every computer-generated illusion in modern warfare can trace its lineage back to those artists and dreamers who once painted tanks on canvas and fooled the desert fox. What they created was more than a tactical trick. It was a philosophy. The understanding that war is not only fought with weapons, but with perception, belief, and control of information. They proved that the human mind, when properly guided, could be the most powerful battlefield of all. Today, historians and soldiers alike study their work not for its spectacle, but for its brilliance. Their operations are now taught in military academies across the world as textbook examples of psychological warfare. And yet, even now, many of their names remain unknown, their stories buried beneath classified documents and forgotten files. The world remembers the tanks, the generals, and the battles. But somewhere in the archives, between reports and photographs, lie the traces of men who built an army that never existed and changed the course of history because of it. Their legacy endures in every act of deception that saves lives rather than takes them, in every strategy that values cunning over destruction. They turned illusion into a shield, not a sword. And perhaps that is their greatest triumph. In a century defined by devastation, they reminded the world that even in war, the darkest of human inventions, creativity could still be used to protect, to defend, and in its own strange way, to preserve life. As the winds of the Sahara still sweep across the empty plains where they once worked, the desert remembers. It remembers the ghosts who once walked among its dunes, the soldiers of smoke and shadow, and the war they won without ever truly existing.